Hello, my name is Allison Shantz, and I'm going to analyze a textbook from my content area for my SEC 352 class. The name of the textbook is American Government, manufactured by Pretense Hall, and written by William A. McClanahan. This textbook can be used in American Government classes for grades 9 through 12. I will be looking at Unit 5, which consists of chapters 18 through 21. In the book to determine if this textbook fits the Kentucky Core Academic Standards and is equally representative of diversity. The first standard I'm going to use to analyze the textbook is Standard 2.14. Students understand the democratic principles of justice, equality, responsibility, and freedom and apply them to real-life situations. I used the Likert scale to interpret my key question, which was, using this standard, how often are government principles, justice, equality, responsibility, and freedom represented in the end of chapter assessments, and can they be applied to real-life situations? To answer this question, I based it on data I gathered from the unit and inferred that if the chapter had 5 or more terms relative to basic government principles in the chapter objectives, I placed it under the strongly agree category. If it had 4, I put it in the agree category, 3 neutral, 2 disagree, and 0 to 1 strongly disagree. I interpreted that because these chapters included terms of basic government principles in the objectives, that these chapters accurately represented this standard. I also assumed that if an objective or excerpt from each chapter included situations where terms could be applied to real-life situations, then the chapter also accurately displayed this standard. Based on these assumptions, I have concluded that this unit accurately displays Standard 2.14. The next standard I used for my analysis was Standard 2.15. Students can accurately describe various forms of government and analyze issues that relate to the rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. I again used the Likert scale to display my key question, which was, using this standard, how often do terms concerning the rights and responsibilities of Americans come up in the end of chapter assessments and beginning of chapter objectives? I inferred that if there were signs of citizens voting or serving in a government program or emergency response team, such as military or firefighters, then this standard would be represented by displaying the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Also, this unit discusses civil rights and civil liberties. It can be interpreted from this unit that this standard is represented if each chapter accurately displays these principles in its content. From this data that I have gathered, I have concluded that based on the accurate representation of the rights and responsibilities of citizens, each chapter accurately displayed what was needed to represent this standard. The last standard I used for analyzing this textbook is 2.20. Students understand, analyze, and interpret historical events, conditions, trends, and issues to develop historical perspective. I used the Likert scale again to interpret the data I gathered based on my key question, which is, using this standard, how often do critical questions concerning historical events and issues relate to the material in each chapter assessment? I inferred that if a chapter had 5 or more terms or visuals based on historical events or figures, that this standard was accurately demonstrated. It was also implied through the chapters that if a chapter was named after a historical event, such as Chapter 21 concerning civil rights, or if the chapter had section headings or visuals that displayed historical events, that this chapter followed the standard. From my point of view, this unit accurately displays the standard because each chapter falls under the strongly agree category, based on the data I collected. Based on this analysis, it can be inferred that all 3 standards are met in this unit and that this textbook is appropriate to use in classrooms. This next section is on diversity and how to analyze it in the textbook. The indicators that I am using are race, gender, and age. I will use pictures and examples from the text to interpret if diversity is equally represented in each category. The first question I used to interpret diversity was, through pictures and specific sections in the text, to what degree is race represented relative to the population of the U.S.? The sample I used to compare diversity in the text comes from the U.S. Census Bureau website and is an accurate representation of the current U.S. population. The key question I used to represent racial diversity in this unit is what percentage of pictures and text accurately displays race. I analyzed images based on skin color, eye shape, and hair texture and came to the conclusion that these pictures were not an accurate display of racial diversity in the U.S. compared to the U.S. population because African Americans and Hispanics did not have an equal amount of representation when compared to the U.S. population. I inferred from this data that even though the data was slightly off when compared to the U.S. population, that this text was still a close representation of racial diversity in America and therefore accurately displayed race. The next diversity indicator that I used to analyze the text was gender, and the key question I used for interpretation was gender evenly represented throughout this unit. I gathered data by looking at pictures in the unit and interpreting whether a person was male or female based on face shape, hair length, and stature. So if a picture was more female than male, there would be softer facial features, longer hair length, and a smaller stature. Based on this, I concluded that in each chapter, gender was displayed evenly based on assumptions I made from the text and comparisons to the gender distribution info I collected from the U.S. Census Bureau. I assumed that because this unit represented a different time period and that it included the federal government and the framing of the Constitution, that males would be slightly more represented than females in this unit because they were more likely to hold office in the past and men were who framed the Constitution. Based on this data, I have concluded that this textbook does display gender evenly in this unit. The next indicator that I used to analyze the text was age, and the key question I used to analyze this indicator was, is age range in this unit evenly distributed relative to the time period represented? I used pictures to interpret the age distribution in the unit and used indicators such as hair color, such as gray or balding, obvious signs of aging such as wrinkles or facial hair, and obvious signs of puberty to interpret whether a person was young, middle-aged, or old. It seemed that these pictures displayed tended to represent the middle-aged or older population more than the young, but because of the content represented, the middle-aged and older population would be assumed to be represented more since they can hold positions in office and frame the Constitution. However, based on the U.S. Census Bureau's information, the younger population of the U.S. is higher than the older, and this textbook does not display much evidence of the younger population. So I've made the conclusion that this text is not diverse in age range. Based on all the data and analysis of diversity indicators such as race, gender, and age, I've concluded that this book fits 2 of the 3 categories and therefore accurately displays diversity through the content. The last source I used to analyze this textbook was a Lexile score. I used the site readability/score.com to find the Lexile score, which is reading level at which this book falls under, to interpret if it is an appropriate textbook to use. I typed in 2 paragraphs from each chapter into the calculator and then added them all up and divided them by 4 to receive an overall Lexile score for the book. I found that Chapter 18 received a score of 10.5, which is slightly above the 10th grade reading level, Chapter 19 a 14.5, Chapter 20 a 12.6, and Chapter 21 a 15.4, giving the book an overall Lexile score of 13.3, which is slightly above a high school reading level. This book could be used in American government classes for gifted and talented students, but would not accommodate ESL students in any way unless the text could be translated for these students. These are my references that I used to analyze this textbook. Thank you for watching.